session is called Strengthening Global Security, Soft Power and Military Might. And I'm moderating it. And I am not an expert on military power, military might. Fortunately, I have 3 people here who really are. So they will be giving you more information. But I'm going to perhaps just frame this initially as a kind of, in a cultural relations context, in a culture context. How I kind of read this exam question was really, you know, what do we need? Is it that we need both military might and soft power and culture for a secure and safe world? Well, obviously, as those of you who heard me yesterday will know that I believe cultural relations to be the absolute foundation of national security. And without it, as one of the many elements, we can't have a secure world. I also think that military power is at times absolutely necessary and the right approach. And I think that how the two work together in that sort of continuum, that international relations spectrum, is kind of interesting. And we were looking at this whole idea in the office with a colleague of mine, a couple of you know, Andrew Neil, and we thought about the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy and development, and we thought, well, what's the 4th D? Because culture, unfortunately, doesn't begin with D. But we came up with dialogue, and so we decided that this was definitely the 4th D, and that this is what cultural relations was about. And one of the things that I think we have seen recently is because wars no longer end in sort of, a lot of them don't end in nice peace treaties that everybody signs, the military packs up and goes home, but it seems to continue on, and the military end up staying. And certainly the military with whom I've had contact are some of the most intelligent thinkers and have the greatest understanding of what cultural relations and building trust and understanding is, because they find themselves post the initial conflict of actually having to work with the civilian population. And I think that therefore it's really important to look at it in that context as part of that whole spectrum. And culture and cultural relations is what we can, over I think a long period of time, use to build the long-term trust capital, if you like, between nations. Culture is one of the most effective ways of creating a safe space, and this is why I think cultural is incredibly important in terms of security. Not much good going in there when you're throwing bombs around, but it's very important before and indeed after. And perhaps if we had invested more before, some of the wars that have happened might not have happened. And I think I would like, before introducing the speakers, I'd like to just give you a quote, which I read the other day, which I thought was incredibly powerful. And I'll see whether some of you have come across it as well. We come to believe that messages are something we can launch downrange like a rocket, something we can fire for effect. They are not. Good communication runs both ways. It's not about telling our story. We must also be better listeners. We haven't invested enough in building trust and relationships. The goal is credibility, and we earn that over time. Only through a shared appreciation of the people's culture, needs, and hopes for the future can we hope ourselves to supplant the extremist narrative. We cannot capture hearts and minds. We must engage them. We must listen to them, one heart, one mind at a time, over time. Has anyone else come across that quote in the last few days? Does anyone know who wrote it? Well, my current hero at the moment, who is Admiral Mullen, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I think that it's very significant that sort of America's most senior soldier, if you like, has come out with a comment about building trust, about listening. So that's where I will leave it. We'll listen to our 3 presenters. We'll go in the order of the program. I think I've sort of positioned myself here in between some of our speakers because I heard some of the discussions before over lunch, so I thought I might have to be here to mediate. So I'm going to, Jean-François will start. Jean-François is a retired US Army officer. To perhaps give you an idea of where he's coming from, his forthcoming book is called Toxic US Foreign Policies, How to Kill Many More Americans and Their Image. Frank Hodsall, who is the perfect marriage, if you like, of culture and military might, who has worked both in working as a diplomat as Foreign Service, based in Brussels and NATO, has worked on non-proliferation, but has also been chairman of the NEA. So who better to bring in the view of culture and military might. And finally, Gerlinde Neuhaus, we've just met. And I found, when I was in Brussels, that I was hugely impressed by the work that NATO was doing on public diplomacy. And I knew Jamie Shea very well. And we had a number of projects together. One was around conversations with Russia, for example, where we were trying to engage with young Russians. So I know that NATO takes it extremely seriously and is actually rather effective at it. So we have the experts. I'm going to hand over. This session is 1 hour. I'm going to let everybody speak, and then we'll open it up to questions. Jean-François.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here again. Many of you have met back in November in Paris. This is much more to my taste. It's more like a retreat, and we can get to see each other without the hustle and bustle of a big city. We've never been, in the 40 years that I have tried to learn, master, apply, in a very average manner, the art of war, which doesn't change, as Sun Tzu, which should be our reference, has always said. It is unchanging, and those who violate the rules lose. We've never been in a worse security situation. We create, by the force of things, by our own cultural nature and its manifestation, we create our own threat. Post-Cold War, there was no more parity. There's nothing worse than not having a worthwhile adversary. Cold War kept the world relatively safe. We did pretty well. We had parity. And anytime you don't have parity, there's no negotiations, because both sides have to feel equal pain to want to give up fighting, as goes back thousands of years for man, to negotiate. And the diplomacy is the alternative to what becomes too costly and painful. So you get off your camel or your horse, you go into the tent, and you talk and exchange wives or camels or goods. Try to alternate between that and violence, which is always the costliest. War is a failure state. War is the ultimate resort and always is costly and cost more than it provides. 60 million casualties in World War II, 20 million in World War I. Where are we now? Now, war may be necessary, but it is the absolutely ultimate result. And while we used to say State Department guys will be the first to say, send in the Marines and the rest of us guys will say, hold on a minute. What's the end state? How do we get out of it? So Petraeus in Iraq was the best guy we had for culture, and he was told to make chicken soup out of chicken you-know-what, and he did the best he could with it. But he was given a flawed mission. We shouldn't have been there. It was based on basically lies. It was based on a view of the world which it was for a long time, a view promoted by mostly in great part, the right-wing Americana. Those of you who are familiar with the Project for a New American Century. And taking over Iraq is just a step, like Afghanistan, to go into Central Asia, expanding NATO so we can corner the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and anyone who does not see the world and walks in our own step to our own music. This brings us to our greatest threat, manifested by ourselves in our sense, we Americans leading the pack because we're imbued more than anybody else with our power, and we have a kind of an evangelical sense of ourselves, manifest destiny, etc. We lead the pack, but the West is pretty close behind with exceptionalism, which is a theme of my book and lectures to my students when they want to listen, because the young people are really the only ones I want to talk to, guys my age. We either disagree and don't talk to each other, or if we agree, like with Frank, we're bored. So, and these guys hopefully will do better than we, because the world is worst off. We're broke, and we're in great danger. And our own power is what threatens us, because we have the delusion that military power, raw power, whether it's we or extreme, our extreme example is the unfortunate Israeli regime, which is based on all kinds of flawed premises, and as history has taught us, it is not durable. You cannot survive by pure power. And all I can tell you is what I said on French TV a few weeks ago. They've got the bad taste of inviting me to comment on these things, and there's no accounting for good taste, you know. And I said, you know, look at American embassies. It's a fortress. What does it say? We're under siege. People hate us. And I can tell you that from the Syrian coast, which is Palestine, to the Indus River, Al-Qaeda isn't just in one little corner of Pakistan. That's a myth. That's a buzzword. It's like saying the French resistance against the Germans. There were a whole bunch of groups that hated each other, communist, right-wing and all, but they had one focus. They hated the Germans, and they wanted them out of France. And that's it. And so these people, hundreds of millions, hate us. So our embassies are like fortresses. The day it looks like a Swedish or a Danish or a Swiss embassy, you know that our change of culture in behavior and in our own view of ourselves has succeeded. Now, exceptionalism. I'm going to go through some just bullets, and then we have questions later. It's a Western trait vehicled to extreme expression by American power-based cultural influence. What are the declensions of exceptionalism? You have the double standard. You have extreme applications of raw military power. You have racism, treating the other as we would not want to be treated. One American soldier, one Western, one Israeli soldier gets killed or captured. Oh my God, it's onesies and twosies. But in Fallujah, to knock out a few bad guys instead of going with a can opener and fighting, which is what soldiers are supposed to do, you fight and you take casualties. Now we have the myth that we fight, we take no casualties. So instead of that, you have multiple civilian deaths and hundreds of thousands in Iraq, for which we are responsible because we own the ground. It's a deeply seated value with me. If you're in charge, anything that happens or doesn't under your watch, you're responsible. At Nuremberg, we hanged generals and ministers. We didn't prosecute privates. Abu Ghraib, all I saw was Sanchez and his group wincing before Congress, quivering and saying, well, we had nothing to do with it. That was despicable. It was very disappointing. I wasn't raised that way. I thought better when I took my oath of office at Berkeley in 1965 as a proud, French-born, French-raised, from a resistance family, American officer. And so the last thing is terminology. Terminology is again, exceptionalism. Things apply to us, not to the other. Islamofascism, why? It might exist. Well, then in that case, with 70 million American evangelicals, which Walton Mersheimer, distinguished scholars who have been absolutely under attack for expressing things in a very scholarly way about the Israeli lobby, which is really not Jewish, but it's a whole syndrome of 22% of the American voters who are evangelicals. They have this view of the world, which makes us, you know, the people of exception. We have the answer. Democracy is to us, and the virus spreads to the sense of exceptionalism of our Western friends, of course, because they have the same white man, sort of. I'm using the term white man view of the world. Democracy has become, as I was telling a group in France, listen, the Spaniards had the one true and only Catholic faith. That was the way. And they imposed it, of course, with a sword and fire on the natives of Latin America, what became Latin America, with, as you know, about 25 million deaths. That is our view of the world. And if someone were to come over and say, you know, we have the military dominance, we're going to make you into a monarchy, we would become killers. So not seeing the other, that's exceptionalism. And the manifestations, very simple. 9/11, the root cause, it's not terrorism. It's a worldwide insurgency with the means they had, not having missiles and bombers, to attack what they saw as the seat of the empire. Not, and bin Laden said it, the smartest guy we ever hired to fight the Russians. Always listen to your adversary. Whether you play chess, like Lawrence of Arabia said, to beat your adversary, listen to him, respect him. Don't demonize him. But it's convenient for politicians to do that. Bin Laden said, I'm not attacking you for what you do, for what you are, but for what you do. They don't care if our girls know, you know, in bikinis on the beach. We, however, can't stand the fact that women in Afghanistan and others are treated as we wouldn't. What business is that of ours? Who are we to tell someone else? We can lead by example. How else? How would we take it? So, the post 9/11, what happened after 9/11 is we saw the world as we wanted to see it. It was made to be seen that way by the administration, which basically was made up of people who had been waiting for years to turn the American people into the American dream manifested in 1997, which is really a bipartisan view, not just coming out of the American Enterprise Institute, to establish hegemony over the whole Middle East and Central Asia and Afghanistan and Iraq are only steps to that, which is why they're always uncomfortable telling us where the mission is. It's only a step. Now, Iraq and post-Iraq, exceptionalism. Iraq was a dictator that we armed. Rumsfeld brought him he had this little briefcase in 1975 or 6. He brought him all the chemical weapons means, and we turned him loose on the Iranians. We owe the Iranians an apology. We sicked the Shah on them and the Savak. We trained the Savak with former French torturers from Algeria. We did all this. They only took our embassy. They were very nice to us. They have nukes. So do we. Israel doesn't even have, the French gave Israel the nukes because they wanted to counter Egypt when they were helping the FLN in the 50s. But basically, we can have nukes. You can't. And yet, the two most dangerous, I regret to say, states, countries in the world, by the number of people they've killed, maimed, displaced, and some total terrorized for the last, well, many years, starting with the first intifada for the Israeli and for us with Iraq and Afghanistan, have been the Americans and the Israeli. And Afghanistan, again, is a way of looking at the world as we want to make it. Are you kidding? We could put 1 million troops there. And I would hope Obama has increased the troops only to show that it won't work, because he can't afford to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq at the same time and be called the peacenik. He's got all of deep America to deal with, who are all imbued with this sense of exceptionalism, reinforced by insularity, religiosity writ large, and a sense of impunity derived from imperial power. So those poor folks, now the intelligentsia, I would include us, is hidden behind all this. And getting the message to Americans is very difficult, and politicians certainly take their time to exploit all those weaknesses, including the fear of 9/11. And what do we have now? We have a situation where our view of the world is communicated by a behavior that we would not accept. We are encircling Russia as we would not accept to have people next door in Canada or Mexico do. Look, what did we do about Cuba? And yet we armed, and the Israeli did the training, did the dirty work on that, and we egged on the Georgians to attack the Russians to see what they would do. Well, they did exactly what we would do. We treat Iran as we would not want to be treated. And the bottom line is, when we talk about Islamofascism, which is, for us, would be, if somebody were to look at us objectively, Christo-Ziofascism, as manifested by the American conservative movement and our manifestation of that intolerance and that disregard for the other. Bottom line is, even down to the lives of other people, we want to impose our way. It is the only way, and the most useful thing, I would think, as a military man for the Aspen Institute is to work on the American people and change their views, help change it, before we do anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, sorry to try and push you on ahead.
I guess I'm on.
Frank, you're next.
I was going to talk about the subject before us, which is military security, soft power, and military might. Jean-Francois has gone at great length to describe what he views as the negative nature of many policies that are not only above the United States, but many of the U.S. allies and so on. So before I get to soft power and military might, I have to say at least 3 or 4 things, and then I'll go on to the subject matter that is before us. The first is that there is less conflict today by almost any measure than there was during the Cold War because of the proxy wars that were going on all around the world. And I didn't come here prepared for this, but I can provide statistics on that from a wide variety of sources, not just American. Secondly, the fact that our embassies, our fortresses, was the result of bombings in Africa long before Iraq, and et cetera, that were instigated by Al-Qaeda. This was the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which injured and killed essentially Africans. They didn't really kill our folks, and there was a result of that in the Clinton administration and carried on in the Bush administration to fortify the embassies. I would agree with Jean-Francois that that's a very unfortunate result because they do indeed look and act like fortresses. And in my view, they don't need to be quite so fortress-like, but there was a feeling in the Congress by both parties that we couldn't tolerate having more people killed who were there. The third point I'd like to make, before getting in, I agree with Jean-Francois that for Americans or for the West in general, to talk about how exceptional Western thought is from the Greeks on, and particularly in the Enlightenment on, is not the way to make friends in other countries who didn't have that Western background. There's no question about it. People will resent it because if you go back in time to the 7th century, to the time of Muhammad and what happened in North Africa thereafter and in Spain, where the Umayyad dynasty was, etc., at that time, Islam was, for the most part, and there were some glaring exceptions to that, at the beginning of what became the Shias, there was extraordinary brutality towards Ali and so on, but that was not Muhammad's way. And that was not the way in which the initial caliphates operated. So they, unlike the Spanish monarchs of we're here in Spain, but that was a long time ago, or you could take examples from the United States or from Great Britain or other countries as well, or take the Reformation, which in the wars of the Christian wars, which were more brutal, or let's put it this way, every bit as brutal as anything that was brutal in Islam, in Christianity, because there were some very brutal things in Islam as well. The exceptionalism aspect of it that is, espoused by not just Christian evangelicals in the United States, but every conceivable kind of person. Even a former boss of mine, Elliot Richardson, who was a Boston Brahmin, very liberal Republican, probably could have been a Democrat, used to talk about American exceptionalism. And it's okay to talk about that in a Boston club, but it's certainly not okay to talk about that in Amman or some other place in the world. So that's something we need to look about. And the final point I'll make on this, well, let me do one point and then the final point. The point before the final point is that the issue of what people wear, particularly women and so on, is you could argue about some of the American examples, but I will never forget that it was in France that that the school system was forbidden women to wear veils. But countering that, on the other side of exceptionalism, if you will, is the issue of what the Taliban did to women in Afghanistan. If you go back in time to when there was a king in Afghanistan, women were in the legislature, a substantial proportion of them. And it is true that it was the United States helping some of the more extreme mujahideen in the Reagan administration to knock back the Soviet army, which had invaded Afghanistan, that empowered what became the Taliban. While all of that is certainly true, look at a movie like Osama, which was made some years ago about what happened to women in the Taliban regime. And in terms of art and culture, a very close friend of mine tried with Muslim clerics, some of the best from Egypt and Jordan, to go and stop the Taliban from blowing up the Bamiyan Buddhas, which are World Heritage Sites. They failed, but one should not celebrate that as a matter of culture either. And so finally, bringing this to closure, I think it's important to note that no one is perfect. And there have been a lot of wars fought, including the Second World War, where you could argue, why did the United States go to war against Germany? Why should we try to change what the Third Reich wanted to do in Europe, et cetera, or against Japan, where we were, in fact, attacked? The problem that the United States basically has is because, and now I'm going to really get into the subject here, because we have the largest military force in the world, basically larger than the aggregate of the next 9 nations, which includes China, etc. We are called upon, and it's not always our choice, though we ultimately have to agree, to be in countries all over the world to try and be of help. We are in more than half of the countries in the world. Again, I can come up with the precise number. I wasn't prepared to do that. And in most cases, we're a very welcome presence. We're either helping, and this is military, we're either helping with some dissident. I know a lot about Mindanao in the southern part of the Philippines. I used to have a business there. We're helping some dissidents. They've been there since the Spanish days, for 100 years. They've been attacking every government that came, the Hukbalahaps they're called. They have a different name now. And so America, because it has this capacity at American taxpayer expense, is found in a wide variety of places, as we were in NATO when there was worry about the Soviet Union moving beyond where it had come to a stop halfway through Germany into other parts of the country. So while nothing is perfect, I think I would suggest that there is another side to what Jean-François was talking about. So let me now quickly get in to soft power and military might.
We're now going to answer the exam question.
Well, okay, we'll get on to the real exam question, but I felt I simply had to say something. I couldn't let it go. I asked to be on this panel. I'm not sure why I asked at this point, but the reason is because I didn't see anybody who was going to be on the panel who was likely to talk about what the U.S. military, and because it's such a large military, it has some consequence, what they are doing today about soft power in respect, and obviously they have military might as well. And so I'm going to begin with an anecdote from the past, which I was talking with. You should know that my second post in the Foreign Service, I was an assistant to General Lemnisser, who was then the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, at SHAPE just after the French had thrown us out. And so I lived with the American, not just the American military, everybody's military in what was then NATO. Even the French were there during the invasion of Czechoslovakia during the brief spring in 1968. That shows you how long ago that was. But I'm going to fast forward, and this gets into soft power specifically. President Nixon at the time, with, if you can believe it, Pat Moynihan, who was a counselor in the Nixon White House at the same time. He later became an extraordinary Democratic senator from New York, came up with the idea on the 20th anniversary of NATO of creating a committee on the challenges of modern society. We called it CCMS. Pat was the first person in it, and then I joined Russ Train, who was the chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality, then went over with him to EPA, to do a series of pilot projects. The goal in things like the environment, and bear in mind, back in the early 70s, the environment was a brand new subject. It was a brand new subject. We just had a panel on the environment here. It was a brand new subject in the United States, and it was even a more brand new subject in Europe. And so the idea was, because there was a Vietnam War going on, that's American, at the time, and in order to get more young people, not only in our country but in other countries, to have a more benign view, if you will, to what was largely a military alliance. So let me hasten to point out that in the preamble to the North Atlantic Treaty, it is not about military, it is about a community of values. And that's what's in the North Atlantic. Obviously, military was important because of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and all of that. But the idea here was to create another side to NATO, and I was privileged to be a part of that. We built sewage treatment plants. This was long before people did this, tertiary sewage treatment plants in Great Britain. We helped to bring about national legislation in France and Germany for seat belts, something the Australians had invented and we lately got into it, etc. We did a whole bunch we had education programs, we had emergency medical service programs, et cetera, et cetera. I invented a whole bunch of energy programs, which resulted in my getting promoted, because they all happened before the energy embargo. And I was the only person who knew about Japanese cement plants in the State Department, which is a kind of an unusual thing to know about. But the point I'm making here is that this was an example in NATO of smart power, of soft power, in what was essentially a military operation. I mean, it was more than a military operation, but it was essentially. And the reason why that soft power worked is because, if you can believe it, I could write letters and get the auto pen of President Nixon affixed to them. And I could get Henry Kissinger to go forward. And we had assistant secretaries from our domestic departments meeting with assistant secretaries from the European and Turkey departments. It had to take, in order to make that work, and I think we did some good work, in order to make that work, we had to have the ability to reach heads of government and the highest people in the land, and we had to have a sustained, all during the 3 years I was doing this, we could gather people to do this, and we got good publicity. We changed some laws. There were seatbelt laws later on almost everywhere, and the like. And that is soft power, and it had the NATO emblem. And so NATO was no longer just a military alliance. It was also something where a community of nations gathered together to do something good. Now let me turn to Joe Nye, who's the one who I don't know whether he invented the word soft power, but he's often associated with having invented it. I did not invent it, etc. What Joe talks about, and he's a terrific guy. He talks not about smart power or soft power. He talks about smart strategies that combine the tools of hard power and soft power. Because often to get things done in certain parts of the world, or even in your own country, you have to have both. President Eisenhower had talked about leadership being about getting people to do something, not only because you tell them what to do, but to enforce your orders, but also to get them instinctively to want to do it for you. And Eisenhower was an extraordinary example of this as a leader in World War II, the first SACEUR, the first Supreme Allied Commander, and then as a president, though he was most inarticulate, he was awfully good at this side of things. He is the only guy at that level who, way back in his administration, had a summit on citizen diplomacy. That is, citizens doing things with other citizens all over the world. And there are some people now in the United States who want to recreate that with President Obama. Let me turn now to a different side of this. Fareed Zakaria has written a really excellent book, I commend it to all of you, called The Post-American World. And it's important to keep that as things have changed. It's a different world than it was either as the time of the Cold War or even in the very recent past. And while the post-American, I'm going to tell you what Fareed at least thinks about that. Well, that does not mean the end to American leadership, perhaps, at least in some areas. It is similar in that respect to the fact that the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't mean the end of history, because history has continued. I'd like to also point out that the nation state is a relatively new phenomenon. Now we're getting into culture, not just the arts, but all of culture. Much older, the religious, ethnic, and linguistic groups that live within nation states, and we've seen that in spades in the more extremist aspect, and there have always been extremists all throughout history. There have been bands of people who try to knock down the established order. Sometimes they may be right to do it, and sometimes they may not be right. But the cultural aspect of this is critically important. And I'm going to say something else. Culture has its good sides, and it has its bad sides. I was recently in India. We traveled in a car all across South India, from Kerala all the way through Tamil Nadu until we got to Chennai. And I had a lot of introductions. I wanted to see temples. I'm interested in temples. And that was the part of India that was Hindu almost throughout. There was practically no Muslim incursion there. I wasn't there because there had been no Muslim incursion, but I also went into the Muslim area, but I wanted to see what happened in South India. And one of the things that I thought was interesting there, and this is cultural, I went into several schools, both elementary and middle and high schools. And two of them that I went into, I was told by the principals that these are untouchable schools. And I said, really? I said, why is that? I think there's a law in India that says that the untouchable caste is not to be treated as untouchables. And I was told, well, in Tamil Nadu, that may be the law, but that's not what we do. And we need people for the lower orders of economic, employment and so on and so forth. And so they retained those schools. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, because this this is an element behind what soft power needs to be about, is because and you know, it was a Western idea probably as a part of the British Raj that created the laws about the caste system that exists today in India. They haven't changed. But the fact of the matter is that you get down locally, not all of these things come to pass. So the reason I'm putting that out there is to simply say that when you're talking about soft power or smart power or things in addition to the military, whether the military do them or some other, or civil society does it, or some other part of government does it, you've got all of these layers. It's all very complex. It can't be simply arrayed, well, here are the good guys and here are the bad guys. Now, what is the Defense Department doing today? And I will finish with that. And believe you me, you mentioned General Petraeus, Jean-Francois, and there's no question he was is a much more astute a general than some of the other generals, but people change. General Odierno, who's now in charge of our Iraq operation, was really problematic, but he's converted, and he's very much a part of the Petraeus team today. But let me turn to what's going on now. The Congress has been concerned about this as well. In January of 2009, it was a requirement of the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act. There was a quadrennial, every 4 years, the Defense Department does a major study. The quadrennial roles and missions review report, and I'm not going to go through it in detail except to say that very high on the list is that not only irregular forces, which means the special forces that go in hither and thither under the radar, but also our conventional forces, the regular forces, need to have language training. They need culture. They need to be fully apprised on the cultural aspects of the countries into which they may or may not be going, et cetera. And so there is a realization of that. Secondly, there is a requirement that there be developed in the United States government a coherent framework for developing what they call a whole-of-government approach for addressing national security challenges. And this is being debated seriously, not only on the Hill, et cetera. I mean, we're already doing some of this in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other places around the world. But there's a much higher, and because these quadrennial reports come up through the bureaucracy, there's also a bureaucratic imperative that is, and the State Department is involved in this, and the Defense Department has committed to providing the State Department with more resources for these kinds of purposes. And again, just a brief anecdote to tell you, I'm involved with a group that's called U.S. ICOMOS. It's about preserving sites, cultural sites, World Heritage and otherwise. And there is a real interest in the Army of getting into their GPS system information as to where the archaeological sites are so that they can try to avoid them. That's an element of soft power. You're not always going to be able to, but at least that's there. And finally, I think I'll just conclude by saying that the issue of military power and soft power has been an issue from the beginning. If you go back into Islamic history, if you even go back to the early days after Muhammad went to Medina and so on and so forth, you will discover that one of the things that he did that was unusual in those times was not to kill all the men and enslave everybody else after he had defeated an army of the Qurayshi in Mecca and so on and so forth. And some of the caliphs who followed him didn't follow that. They went in a different direction. They basically slaughtered everybody. Western countries did that too. And there's always been a tug and a pull, at least in my view, between soft power and hard power. But coming back to Joe Nye, it's the smart decisions. Some of the most successful governmental activities, whether they are Islamic or Chinese or Western or you name it, have been those that while they have employed hard power have also realized that at the end of the day you've got to have a degree of acceptance of the legitimacy of the hard power, even if you resent it, or a degree of acceptance of the fact that this has happened, so that you can have a degree of peace and you're not losing soldiers and sailors thereafter as a result. So this has been an issue of hard and soft power from the beginning of time. And we're in it again today, and the big difference today is that while we have been largely a nation state set of backs and forths, we are, and again, this is not brand new, there is a much greater degree of the people being involved in all of this, and the civil societies being involved in all of this. I have one last point, and I promise absolutely to start.
We're running very late.
Okay, my last point is the U.S. government still hasn't adopted or totally, embraced the importance of our and other people's civil societies in all of this. And that's stupid. And hopefully there will be opportunities to encourage more of that, not only in our country, but in other countries. There is a tremendous bureaucratic imperative simply to advance the causes of your own silo. So that's something that's also got to be dealt with. Thank you. I'm sorry to go so long.
20 minutes? Okay. Our last speaker, but I'm going to say one thing. Odierno, the conversion, in part perhaps because one of his special advisors is actually Emma Skye, a former British Council employee who worked in cultural relations and actually was pretty much anti the war, and I think it's hugely respected. So cultural relations is getting in there somewhere. Please, Galinda.
Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. I would like to offer some thoughts from a NATO perspective on the evolution of soft and hard power through the organization. But I promise to be brief. I will focus on three main points, really, at the end of a probably very long day. So let me start with my first point. When we're looking at the evolution of soft and hard power in NATO, and the organization is this year actually celebrating its 60th anniversary. So some say we are at an age of retirement, others say we are still needed. So we are 60 years old. We were created at the beginning of the Cold War, clearly at a time of confrontation, tension in international politics. So at that time, NATO was very much focusing on hard military power, on security via defense and deterrence. So that was really the core of it at the very beginning. Frank alluded to that. At one point, that was, if you wish, a kind of culmination point of hard power in its hardest way, if you wish. NATO adopted a mission statement, if one can say it that way, where the whole defense was based on the concept of massive retaliation. Now, to be very clear, massive retaliation in the time meant use of nuclear arms. Yeah? So it was at that point. Clearly, later on, it was softened. I mean, it was then adopted as an approach to flexible response. But in the 50s, in the year of the 50s, in the whole context of the Korean War, the concept of NATO was massive retaliation. So during this entire Cold War period, hard power was very much at the core of the alliance. But hard power as a means to achieve political and military goals. So hard power was not an end in itself. Hard power was used at the end to defend democracy, freedom, and human rights. Frank mentioned the clause at the beginning of the North Atlantic Treaty, and indeed, there the alliance defines itself first and foremost as an alliance of civilization, if I can use a term which probably is very popular in Spain these days. So those were the the days of the Cold War. But then when you come to my second point, when you look into the period after the Cold War with the demise of the Soviet Union, our kind of formidable enemy disappeared. I mean, four more enemies, including Russia, became either partners. A number of them have become members in the meantime. So in this period, whilst defense and deterrence still remained the underlying rationale of the alliance, the emphasis shifted towards dialogue and cooperation on one side as a very important soft power component, which has been increasingly ever since then, and also to crisis management operations. So in many ways, if you wish, the whole portfolio of the organization changed very much, and NATO became an organization not only of being, but an organization of being and and doing. So partnership and dialogue means, for example, that we started a whole network of cooperation initially with countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but then increasingly with the Mediterranean countries, with countries in North Africa, including Israel. We are now moving also to work systematically with countries such as Japan, Australia, and others which are, for the time being, involved in our operations, but which clearly have a broader potential than just that. So those two aspects, dialogue, cooperation, and partnership, have become an increasingly important portfolio of the organization. And the second important portfolio, which really became a NATO leg or a NATO component after the end of the Cold War, were missions and operations. Now, here we have the situation that missions and operations are, in a way, they are a combination of hard and soft power, because yes, there are in operations where fighting takes place. Best case is Afghanistan, but clearly also in the 90s this happened. So you have the use of military hard power, but it doesn't stop there. You need also soldiers with a lot of soft power skills, cultural sensitivity, awareness of the religion, the legacy, and the values of the country they are working in, and often those soldiers also do soft power work. Give you one example, in Kosovo, in KFOR these days, we still have a medical component there who treats the local population for whatever surgery necessities they have. So they give that medical services also to the local population. So in many ways, the point I'm making is that after the end of the Cold War, the soft power components increased in their prevalence in NATO. So that brings me actually already to my third point, that I believe that this prevalence of soft power in NATO will increase in the years ahead. The background to that is that we embarked this year actually on defining a new, we call it strategic concept, but in many ways what it means is a mission statement for NATO, defining the new raison d'être, the new rationale of the alliance. So, and what it is likely to bring with it are a couple of points which are clearly soft power components, soft power related. One is again the aspect of partnership, because we realized that whilst the organization will probably remain a regional organization, so we're not talking about, I don't know, China to become a member, the need to engage with China, India, and others is in the increase. So we probably will have more and more global partnerships, even if the term itself is not yet a NATO terminology, but that is de facto what we are witnessing. We also have, in many ways, a situation where the new security threats cannot be dealt with by military responses alone, or let me put it the other way around. There are many security threats these days. Cybersecurity, energy security, the melting of the ice caps, to just mention a few, which do require collective responsive, joint responsive, but rarely military responsive. These threats are real, they can tear the fabric of any society, but thinking that you can deal with them with traditional military responses is probably an error. But that means for NATO, of course, that we need to look into reinforcing the political dimensions of what the organization is doing, the political dialogue within the organization. So hence another trend to reinforce soft power. Another aspect which will, again, bolster soft power components of the organization is the realization that, I alluded to that before, that military power is rarely in a position to solve conflicts. I think Jean-François alluded to that. We see this in Afghanistan. The fighting itself doesn't bring peace. Yeah? You have to combine it with economic measures, with education, with reconstruction, with development, with public diplomacy, and the like. So we realize that whilst military power may be necessary in certain situations to allow the other activities to go on or to take place. We also realize the limitations of military power. And that also means that, looking at it from another angle, that we need to reinforce what we call in our jargon comprehensive approach. You refer to that briefly, that we need to dovetail what NATO is doing very closely what other international organizations are doing, be it the EU, be it the UN, and subsidiary organizations belonging to the United Nations. So that means also NATO as a partner, or as, if you wish, as a hub in a network of partners to stabilize or to bring peace and security to, or more peace and security to the world. So those are some pointers which I wanted to share with you to show you that whilst we are using hard power, it's a kind of paradox. Whilst we are using hard power, its relative prevalence has decreased, and the relative weight and importance of soft power is likely to increase. We are also very aware of the dimension and the importance of, it was referred to also in the earlier panel, of listening and understanding our audiences and understanding where they come from. So we try to become more an organization which is not the military organization sort of cloaked in secrecy, but rather to make the organization as transparent as we possibly can make it. There are limits to that, I have to admit that, and there are certain papers which are NATO secret and stuff like that, so I can't quote from those. But we try to push the envelope as far as we possibly can, because we also believe that in many ways the rationale of the organization also stands and falls with the people understanding what we are doing. So that's another aspect of soft power, if I may. My last point, and then I finish. What you also see in NATO is a kind of the fact that soft and hard power are not opposing poles. It's not a kind of dichotomy which is mutually exclusive. What you see in the organization when you look through its 60 years of existence is that they have always been developed in tandem. Whilst during the Cold War, clearly deterrence defense was very much brought forward. It was also in those early days that via the so-called report of the Three Wise Men, the dimensions of scientific and technical cooperation were instigated. Cultural cooperation was mentioned in that context. Frank referred to the creation of the then called CCMS, Committee on Challenges of Modern Society, which still exists under another label. It's our scientific cooperation program. So but that started in the 50s. That started in the 50s. And then in the 60s, another element of, if you wish, of soft power was added through the so-called Hamel report, who actually said, well, deterrence and defense is good, but we also have to actually embrace dialogue and détente. That was the term of the time. That was in the 60s. Yeah? So it shows that it has never been a kind of mutually exclusive relationship. It has been a mutually enriching relationship, let me call it that way. And then if you look at military today, I would make the case that in most cases they're actually double-headed, if I can call it that way. You have soldiers in Afghanistan building schools, bridges, digging water wells and the likes. Clearly this is something which people would associate with soft power, yeah? But then of course the same troops are also called upon to fight the Taliban. Yeah? So that also means for the individual soldier that much more is required of them in terms of breadth and width of capacities. Yeah? So, but ultimately, my closing point, if I may say so, even when we use hard power in the most traditional sense, I think we should never forget that we don't do it for an end in its own. It's a means to an end, and the end is really to help security and peace for all of us. And that's something we also try to then explain to broader audiences in order to show why NATO matters. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had quite chunky presentations, I think. We have a fairly unforgiving view of US policies from Jean-François. I think, Frank, I think we all appreciated, well, your response, that you responded, and then you did answer the exam question. And thank you, I think, as well, it's always interesting to hear the other side of NATO. But I'd like to open it up because I suspect there are some questions from the floor, several at least. Yes, first one there. Would you like to find a microphone? One there, and then maybe Rita was the other hand I saw. Do you want to go and approach the other microphone? Ready? Okay.
Twice. Okay. My name is Hazami Barmada, and I actually just had a question that you touched upon at the very end of your discussion. When we talk about the military, we often don't talk about the military in a humanized way. The military is people that make up this military might. And you talked about the fact that a lot of military soldiers are also doing reconstructive work on the ground. Now, we also know in the United States that there's an increasing number of suicides that are taking place in the population of U.S. soldiers that are returning to the United States that cannot acclimate back into society because the fact that they were military officers killing people, and then the same people that they were killing, they were turning around and also lending a hand to. So what, and kind of following on that, the military has a very large diplomacy budget. So what is being done to turn the lenses inwards and to help our own military in what we're doing, given that they have an extremely large task ahead of them, and what type of collaborative work is being done with the State Department to address some of the, initiatives that are taking place within the American troops overseas and then when they return home?
I think Frank, because
Okay.
if it's a specific U.S. military question,
Yeah.
I think Frank probably is the best.
One, you describe a problem that is very important, and it is a problem. There's more increasing. I'm not an expert on this, incidentally, but there is increasing evidence that not just officers, but in particularly enlisted people returning from particularly Afghanistan and Iraq, but some other places as well, are having trouble readjusting, and there's also the problem of extended tours beyond. In terms of their families at home beyond. The Pentagon is wrestling with that because even though we're pretty large, we don't have enough troops to do all of these things. We are extraordinarily stretched. And there isn't an answer to what you have just said. The one thing that I do know is that Secretary Gates, who is, in my view, a terrific guy, is making an enormous, he's fired some people, among other things, making an enormous effort in making sure that people who are coming back have mental health as well as, physical health in terms of limbs that have been lost, attention. But the answer is not by any means complete. I don't know enough about it to know whether it's significantly worse today versus, other wars that we've fought in, but it is without question a huge problem.
Perhaps if I may just just offer some it's just information. In the NATO structure on the side of the Allied Command Transformation, which is based in Norfolk in Virginia, under that structure there are certain centers dealing with training and also lessons learned. So and clearly these centers are more and more geared towards preparing people to go to operations on the various levels of the operation, whether it's on the strategic level, in the strategic headquarter, then subordinate command in the military ranking and the like. So there is more and more military doctrine development and military training capacity development taking place. It's probably never enough, and there will always be cases, the ones you refer to, which we have in European countries as well, where soldiers come back from operations traumatized and need medical and psychological help. But there is, I would say, an acute awareness of the need to address these issues, and at least policies and mechanisms and resources are being put into place.
Mm-hmm.
I think I understand soldiers. When a soldier knows when he's in the wrong war for the wrong reason, when he feels pretty much like German soldiers felt on French soil, hated, building wells and all that, sure, a lot of Germans did a lot of work in France, but all the French wanted was them to get out. And if I had been 20 years old in 1943, I would have spent my days killing Germans till they were out of France. I would have been a terrorist. And my family died, my father's family, fighting the Germans, by passing out false IDs for Jews and people going to Spain. 2 points. There is a place for taking care of soldiers after a war. But the wars they're in are wars where you add to the troops, let me tell you what happened, you'll have more suicides. You could put 1 million troops on the ground in Afghanistan. You'd have more casualties, and you would create regionally more enemies. NATO, 50 countries today, 19 before 2001. No mission. There's no mission for NATO. I've been around NATO for 40 years. I served with them in Germany when I was a young officer in 1970, back from Vietnam. NATO is a way to co-opt all the countries from the former Soviet Union, have them dump their Soviet weapons, use our own, great for the arms industry. It's always a good thing. Look for the money. And encircle people and basically block people who don't walk to our step. Chinese, Russians, Iranians, anybody who's out of sync with us. The United States has been trying to get rid of the UN for a long time. NATO is a global army, which is looking for a mission. How do you use the military? Let me give you a couple of examples. Rwanda, where I was an investigator after General Dallaire, whom I got to know when I got there in 95 as, at the UN. Poor guy was watching his own men being killed. Nothing. There's a use for hard power. Palestine and Israel. What have we got? The same situation, if we weren't exceptional about the Israeli regime, which is what it is by our own standards of regime. Excuse me, I'm using our own definition. And a rogue state, okay, founded on ethnic cleansing and sustained through terrorism, state terrorism and repression for 60 years. It's a fact. It's not a fancy. I'm a fact man. I don't have opinions. I have factual judgments that can change based on facts. What do you do with a large army? I used to say, you get out of Iraq, repaint 100,000 helmets blue. We vetoed any intervention since the first and second Intifada in Israel-Palestine, for reasons we all know. Any intervention, 32 times in the UN. We pass a resolution, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, to intervene like we did in Yugoslavia. We go in with, it's good use for about 100,000 troops who should have gotten out of Iraq yesterday, out of Afghanistan. Repaint the helmets blue, take a multinational force, go in, take down both flags, have a mandate for 50 years and a Marshall Plan. Make life livable for both Jews, Arabs, and all. They're human beings, they're not tags. Redo what we didn't do well in 1947, where we created something which was bound to fail. We made the Arab world, which was always benevolent toward the Jews, pay for the grievous crimes of Europeans who, for 20 centuries, bloodied the Jews and killed 6 million of them in World War II. It was convenient. There were a lot of reasons for this. But let's face it, there's a use for hard power. Congo, how many millions have been killed? But like Rwanda, after all, they're Africans. Who gives a damn? We should have, yes, NATO should be in the Congo, not at the steps of China with Russia and Iran being the targets. Iran isn't dangerous. Russia isn't dangerous. The two most dangerous countries, seen from the other view, cultural gentlemen, ladies, cultural view, are the United States of America and the Tel Aviv regime. The number of people killed, displaced, terrorized by what? When they look for one guy who's a bad guy, supposedly, and they eliminate him by blowing up your whole neighborhood. And then there's collateral damage. Does it matter? Nah. They're a bunch of Arabs.
Okay, could we...
So there you are. That's where you use hard power. Use hard power to do things that will make the world better.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm trying to... sorry interrupting, but the question was originally about military, and poor Rita has been standing there. I thought it would be a quick question. Sorry. Could we take maybe a couple from the audience if there are some other comments, and then I'll let the panel have literally a couple of sentences perhaps afterwards. Okay, Rita, if we can take a couple of questions.
I feel like asking a question will doom us all to missing dinner. So I just wanted to quickly ask or say that the distinction between hard and soft power is something that really fascinates me in these conversations, because the erosion of the concept of a theater of war, I mean, there used to be a delineated environment in which a conflict took place between two or more sides of people who were identifiable in a theatrical environment with outfits that delineated them as soldiers or battlefield participants, and civilians were easier to delineate. It doesn't seem like we really have that option anymore, and combined with the fact that the dynamic is more global with a diaspora environment, and therefore cultural dynamics infused into places that are not immediately involved in the conflict, combined with the fact that we have weapons that we can no longer deal. It's almost like any conflict has to be scaled back. You can't explore the full hard power, if you will, because you could destroy the planet that way. So soft power seems to imply that it's an alternative to hard power, when in fact it seems to be a necessary evolutionary step in the concept of war, because we no longer have the luxury of going full throttle in a contained environment. So I guess my question then is, why is it considered soft power when in fact it's more sophisticated in many ways than using we don't have contained battles anymore. So I think the concept of soft power in itself seems somewhat off-putting, because it seems like you're choosing a path that's less hardcore, if you will. But in fact, it seems to be a necessary step forward. So I don't know how just that question of why call it soft power. And I know that Joe and I came up with that term. But do you see it as soft, or do you see it as smart power? I guess
I see it as smart power. I mean, soft power was in the title, so I just went along with it. Excuse me.
We have a question here, and then I think Lynn and Josh, and then we have lots of questions. I think we can take 3 because we're almost at 7 o'clock, so we're all running about half an hour late. Would you like to?
Yes, I'll try to be quick. Frank, you mentioned the whole government approach that's taking place in the United States government. So first I wanted to find out if you or any of the other panelists, what your opinions were on the establishment of AFRICOM in October of 2008, which has really utilized that whole government approach and was very controversial both here and on the continent of Africa. And then on to that, Hazami brought up a point between the relationship between the Department of Defense and state. And so I was wondering if you could also elaborate on where exactly one would draw the line between what we traditionally see soft power being conducted through state and military power, hard power being conducted through the DoD, where you have initiatives like Section 1206, which requires, joint collaboration, but at the same time you see a huge discrepancy in the budget, where, President Obama requested $54 billion for state, $530 billion for the DoD, not counting the $130 billion in overseas contingency operations, which definitely includes developmental and diplomatic initiatives. So where would you see kind of the dividing line and where their various functions are?
Okay, I'm going to take every question first, the 4, because we're running quite late, and then the next person, I think, Lynn, there you are. Would you, Lynn, and then Josh, if that's possible, please. And there was one other person. Cynthia. Okay, do you want to get ready over there?
I just wanted to make a comment that I don't think there have been what we see, the other person was describing as contained battles for centuries. Battles are hardly ever contained. Collateral damage is always terrible. You just have to read about the 30 Years' War, or go back all through history, that the people in the region bore the brunt of war. There was, they took all their food, they took all their livestock, and there was destruction of their towns and villages with accompanying disease and stuff. So the idea of a contained battle, I think, is mostly in Shakespeare. And then I'd also I think someone said that they associate soft power with the State Department. But I beg to differ that there's been a lot of hardball played by the State Department over the years, and I think that's an oversimplification of the real situation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Josh, and then Cynthia.
Specific question for Galinda about NATO's target audience in present day. I've seen some fascinating approaches to new audiences from the posters in Washington to your new Secretary General having both a video blog and using Twitter, and I'm just curious who the new audiences are in using these new forms of media outreach. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cynthia.
I'd like to ask for a moratorium on the word smart power. I want to see someone stand up in favor of dumb power. That term drives me crazy. But there are some forms of soft power that have entered in the military that seem so smart. Like Frank mentioned, the GPS with the antiquities, and now there are these wonderful packs of cards. Like instead of the 52 bad guys, there's now the 52 historic sites and objects and how to behave around them. They're distributed 1 to every 3 military. So that's they learned that running over historic sites and ignoring the museum was a bad idea, and that is entered into strategy from the ground level. There's military training, actually, in antiquities, and a lot of partnership with the Dutch on this, and they've been to Egypt, and we're trained by Zahiwa. So it seems to me such a positive integration into the actual mission. But then AFRICOM was mentioned. Then there seems to be other things that I'm just wondering what they're doing in the military, where I'm not opposed to the idea, but when the military is beginning to organize concerts and they're bringing in musicians, and which in West Africa in particular, where, as we've heard from Yusu Ndour and will experience tonight, music is hugely, hugely important in organizing society. And the military is putting a lot into this now, as I understand it, quite a bit of funding and activity. And I think that the concept is terrific, but then I wonder, why is the military organizing concerts?
Because they've got the money.
Yeah, because they've got the money. Well, that's the answer. And why? The next question is, why do they have that money? And why do they still have that money? And why doesn't anyone ask them to transfer it to another place?
Okay, I'm going to let the panelists have to answer those questions. If you can keep your answers fairly brief, because we're running quite late. Some of them are clearly specific for NATO, some I think for Frank. Frank, would you like to start, please?
Sure. Well, there was a
group
group of questions that concern the Department of Defense and state and the money in relation to those. And somebody mentioned that state can also be about hard power, and indeed they can. And AFRICOM was mentioned. I'll try to take that and very quickly as a lump. It's very difficult to figure out how to, there's all these reports now coming out, and Secretary Gates is really into this. But it's very difficult to know how bureaucratically and in terms of the I'm getting technical now, but the appropriations committees on the Hill, as to how you're going to have enough resources on the State Department's different set of committees, et cetera, versus the Defense Department. The language in the official documents is, in my judgment, going in the right direction, which is that state should be more involved with this because they're not the military and so on and so forth. But practically how that's going to play out, I don't know. In terms of that said, I think it's important to note, Cynthia, you mentioned, the military do have money for musical performances and the like, and it may be more than what ECA has. I don't know that for a fact, one way or the other. But the point I'm making is it's not the right auspice. On the other hand, they have capability. They have, as you were pointing out, Sharon, at the very beginning, there are some amazing military officers. Truly amazing. And I used to be a Foreign Service officer, and there's some amazing Foreign Service officers, but they're also truly gifted military officers. And the argument in favor, if you take away the auspice of the military being heavily involved, is they're there. And they can relate instantly to the needs in Village X versus Village Y, et cetera, as you go through. Now, I'd like to see it be more, what do I want to say, interagency, which is what these reports I was referring to earlier talk about. But getting interagency to work well, I'm an old bureaucrat, basically, is very difficult. And I'm not saying it's that people are evil, it's the way it is. So I think we're still wrestling through that. It's going to take a lot of presidential leadership.
Okay, thank you. Belinda.
Yeah, very briefly.
Target audiences.
Yeah, start with target audiences. Yes, indeed, we try to reach out to broader and what we would call non-expert audiences via new means, and new means also means new media. Web 2.0, Twitter, YouTube, LiveLeak, the blog community. Actually, we are drafting even a policy on how NATO as an organization and the colleagues working there can use these tools, who is allowed to blog on certain websites, etc., etc. The reason behind that clearly is that we realize that if we would only wait for people to come to NATO's website, we limit the number of people we would be talking with. We can invite so many people to experts, to seminars and conferences. So we need to use means of going where the people are. Yeah, and for those who are interested, I brought a couple of CDs showing some of short video clips we have been producing recently, with a view to translating the NATO message into something which we hope is relatable to individual citizens who do not have all the expertise and the NATO jargon with them. So we really try to go out of our closed circles, if you wish.
See them. Those video clips are stunning. They're lush and lavish.
Oh, thank you. Pleased to hear that. So those who wish to see them, they're either on the website or Damien has a couple of copies. But we can discuss further bilaterally if you wish. Then there was a colleague over there asking about soft and hard power. Very briefly, I mean, the point I wanted to convey with so many words was that clearly this comes from the terminology coined by Joseph Nye and his books, but I wanted to also make the case that soft and hard power are not per se bad or good. I mean, they're often associated. Soft power is good. It's the nice part of human beings. It's a nice part of a society. Hard power is ugly, dirty, and military. And I just wanted to in many ways, give the subtext here that it's not that. It's not that either is good or bad, or it's a combination of both. And then, yes, probably we are at smart power. This also is necessary because the security environment and its threat today are so much different from what we had in the 90s and even in the year 2000, because we basically have a security situation which is largely unpredictable. And that is actually the threat we are dealing with. We do not know what is going to happen. And that means we have to have the intelligent mix of soft and hard power. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we're missing, before I come to Jean-François, we're missing answers to a couple of questions, which was the establishment of AFRICOM, which nobody's answered.
I can answer
and also, I think the issue...
Americans, so...
Yeah.
I can answer AFRICOM.
And also the issue of, I think, the collateral damage, which I think that is always an issue. So
AFRICOM is an adjunct to soon to be the global army of NATO, which is a US-led initiative to have a worldwide army. AFRICOM is one of its adjuncts. We're going to get African countries involved in this. You join NATO, or you help NATO indirectly, and we help you, and we give you what you need. That's the answer. Check me out on this. Number two, this is sophistry. This whole business of soft and hard power. Excuse me, folks, but, you know, I've watched this for 40 years. We still talk about power. Any military presence that is mostly unwelcome. Our military presence in the world today, and if we double it, triple it, it'll just triple the problem, only creates more insecurity for us. And by the way, I said it during lunch about theater between Israelis and Palestinians. Give me a break. We're talking like, you know, the medieval theologians. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? That was a big discussion. That's what I hear here. Excuse me. The answer is we've over-militarized our approach. Anything given to people under military presence or occupation, most of our military presence, believe me, is either tolerated or unwelcome, is not going to work. Would it work for us if we had a benevolent military presence, huge one, about 5 million soldiers in the United States, let's say, who were building wells and doing things, and, are you kidding? We'd take to the hills, take out our Winchesters and kill them. So that's the answer. Let's get out of the sophistry, put ourselves here at the Aspen Institute in the mind of the recipient. And all this BS about providing all this help and soft and all, I'm sorry, but the soft and hard power I've heard for 15 years, and it is bunk. It doesn't work, and it's just a way to feed a system which has over-militarized itself. As Cheney said, why'd you go to Iraq? Because I could. The greatest problem is when you have a military that is now volunteer. And I used to think a professional army was a good thing. But in fact, it gives an adventurous government an irresistible temptation to do everything with it. So everything is based on, notice, power. You don't use power with people. Because if you use power with people, they will use their own asymmetrical power against you. And our militarization of the world has to be reduced by about 90% if we want not to be under attack. I've only watched this for 40 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're running late. I'd like to say thank you to our panelists. I think it was great to get different perspectives. Thank you as well to the audience, because it's pretty late. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.